Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Global Solidarity Network Town Hall Forum on the Arab Spring here at Villanova University. Today we will learn about how Catholic Police Services is responding to the changing events in the Middle East. The Global Solidarity Network program is a unique online learning experience that connects college classrooms to CRS staff who are shaping the world's response to global hunger, health, and poverty. This semester we have chosen to focus on the Arab Spring and how CRS is responding. For decades, CRS has worked with local partner organizations to relieve human suffering, meet human need, and build peace. The challenge before CRS now is how to respond, given its history, its Catholic roots, and the principles that guide it. CRS invites us to connect with the people and their struggles in this region, to generate a sense of solidarity, and to enable us to become more informed and more engaged citizens. Citizens who take our responsibility seriously to shape policies that are just, humane, and further peace. My name is Lou Charest, and I'm the advisor for university programs at Catholic Police Services. I'm also a proud graduate of Villanova University in 2004. I'm joined by my colleague Mark Schnellbacher, who just got back from Iraq and Lebanon, and also Dr. Catherine Warwick, who taught me everything I know about the Middle East. Mark's going to begin with a 10-minute opening statement about CRS's work in the region and how we're changing based on the new response and new reality. Dr. Warwick will offer us some geopolitical context, and then we're going to turn the floor over to you. We'll take questions from you, our audience, and we also have videotaped questions that I've collected from the 10 other campuses that are participating in the GSN. So we look forward to a lively interaction, and thank you for being here this morning. Let me start by introducing Dr. Catherine Warwick. Dr. Warwick is an assistant professor of political science here at Villanova, where she is also a member of the Center for Arab and Islamic Studies and the Gender and Women's Studies program. Her primary research areas are comparative law and gender and Middle East politics. She is the author of Law in the Service of Legitimacy, Gender and Politics in Jordan. Professor Warwick is currently researching the uses of Islamic law in the United Kingdom and Canada, a project supported by funding from the National Science Foundation Law and Social Science Program. Mark Schnellbacher has been the regional director for Catholic Police Services in Europe and the Middle East since 2003. In his 15 years with CRS, Mark has served in Thailand, Pakistan, Cambodia, Macedonia, Kosovo, and Serbia. He has also held several positions at CRS headquarters in Baltimore. Mark is a graduate of Georgetown University and holds graduate degrees in theology and public administration from Harvard University. A native of Saratoga Springs, New York, he currently lives in Beirut, Lebanon, where our CRS Europe and Middle East office is located. Mark, if you could start us off.
Sure, thank you, Lou. Thank you for getting up early and joining us. I'm benefiting from jet lag, so that's why it's easy for me to hopefully make it through the day. I just wanted to make a few comments about what CRS as a Catholic and American agency is seeing and what we're wondering about is going on in this Arab Spring and how we're beginning to shape and reshape our program and react to what we see happening around us. I just wanted to sort of situate myself in this. In the last 2 months, I've been to the West Bank and Gaza, I've been to Amman, I've been to Baghdad, and I've been to Cairo twice since the middle of late August, actually. CRS in the Middle East has 15 expatriate staff and about 160 nationals. We've been operating in the Middle East since 1956, since the Suez Wars when we first started operating in the Middle East. And this year, so we're celebrating 55 years, and we're also celebrating 50 years this year in the occupied Palestinian territories. So we've been around a long time in the Middle East, and we're looking at a completely different operating environment than that which we've become host to. I think it's fair to say, and quite honest, that just like most everybody else, we were surprised at what started last December. Certainly the people throughout the Middle East, citizens of these countries, the regimes, their security forces, their intelligence forces, our intelligence agencies, our diplomats, the investors, everybody. And we certainly, while we largely welcomed many of the changes, it caught us quite unawares. I think, the big questions, where did it come from? Why now? Why all at once? What are people looking for? Did they finally reach some kind of a critical mass or ultimate frustration where it just spilled over and continues to spill over? And then, of course, the other question is, where's it all going to go? Which is still largely an unstated, everybody's question, and one that you hear about as many answers to as there probably are people within the Middle East. And it's certainly one that both excites us, but also does cause us, I would say, pretty significant worries in some ways, and how this is all going to be played out, what decisions are going to be made first and foremost by the citizens of these countries now that they've moved. In many ways, I think I would describe it as saying, many people throughout the Middle East are in some stage of the process of moving from being subjects, either of kingdoms that continue to exist or of these authoritarian regimes, and now they're becoming citizens. One of the big issues that everyone is facing is, what do they mean by this? Well, what does it mean to be an active citizen under still very much unsettled and political systems, new governments, new constitutions that will be emerging? What does it mean to be a citizen? What kind of responsibilities do we have? Previously, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but basically there was a deal for the last 50 years or so throughout the Middle East was certain things were given by the government and the price that was asked to be paid by citizens that was sort of, it might be a little strong to call it a social contract, but basically subsidized food, subsidized utilities, guaranteed jobs in mammoth bureaucracies of the government, and that sort of went along. And yet then the government the price that people paid was freedom of conscience, active political participation, bogus elections, manipulated elections. All of that's now off the table. As you've heard, the Arab Spring, one of the complaints, especially among young people, was the lack of economic opportunities, the lack of social justice and whatnot, and then the whole box of political participation was also opened up. So huge amounts of expectations have been unleashed, and some of them are being pursued, some of them are being frustrated and disappointed, and it's very much an ongoing process that we and local organizations, local governments, investors, everybody, and including our government very much, which I think is the American government, very mixed opinions about where all this thing is going, and so everybody's just sort of waiting and seeing what's happening literally every day. Just this past weekend in Tunisia, there have been the first elections since the Arab Spring began. This is to elect a caretaker government and a constituent assembly that's supposed to draft the Constitution. It appears that it was a remarkable turnout, more than 80% of registered voters, and also one where what is described as a moderate Islamist party has taken a significant portion of the seats. So we're going to see where that all heads. For us, we're wondering where is it all headed? For a number of reasons. First is the operating constraints and environment we work in have completely changed. For years throughout the Middle East, we became at first directly and then more subtly or out of habit. Certain areas we just didn't go. Certain kinds of programming we just couldn't do because of the nature of those regimes, and in some places like in Syria, we're largely a closed society. So those constraints, we got into the habits of not going into certain areas, not raising certain topics. A lot of that is all being rewritten now. As social contracts are being debated and renegotiated, as people are debating and defining what does it mean to be a citizen in these new political systems that are emerging, we need, as an organization, we need to sort of shed some of these old habits, be a little bit more risk-taking, be a little bit more open to what sort of things we're going to do. This particularly involves civic participation activities among young people who are obviously have a hugely important role to play both in the Arab Spring and what follows, and yet we and a lot of local organizations have sort of, for self-protection, I guess you would say, we stayed away from a lot of the controversial things. So we have to rethink how we're going to approach that. Secondly, is this whole issue I raised earlier, is that people are no longer subjects, but are debating and seeing what does it mean for them to be citizens. This will have quite a different impact on what kind of local organizations and associations and groups people form, where previously these were closely monitored, in many cases suppressed. These are now emerging, and we, as a foreign organization working in the Middle East, have to adjust ourselves to how we're going to work in both these emerging new organizations, but also ones that are adapting themselves. The biggest question, as far as I can see, not only for us, but it certainly does affect us, is how will long repressed Islamist parties be incorporated into these emerging civil and political structures? This is the big unanswered question that I think is below many of the concerns at both the geopolitical level, at the local economic level, at the civil society level in these countries. Related to that, and this is of particular interest to us as both an American organization which values things like religious freedom and expression and the exercise of religious freedom, but also as a Catholic organization, what place, if any, are religious minorities going to have in the Middle East? Certainly if we look at Iraq, where since 2003 the Christian community has been decimated, probably having lost 2/3 of its number, if that's what we're looking forward to, it's a pretty frightening prospect. And it very much is one that we're now looking at, for example, in Syria, which many people find kind of odd that the Christians are either sitting it out, the uprising, or at least on the part of their leadership, the Christian religious leadership, are basically supporting Assad. And essentially, when you ask them why, it's the devil we know. And we look to see what happened next door to Iraq, and we're really frightened what may happen if this regime goes and we deal with whatever comes next. So as an American Catholic organization, this is a growing concern for us. Because we are, by mission, we're not a proselytize, we don't proselytize, and our assistance is strictly provided on the basis of need but not creed. But here we may be a situation where our co-religionists are becoming, in some places and possibly elsewhere, becoming a uniquely persecuted group, one that needs assistance if we take a wider or a thicker view of poverty. If we take a thin view of poverty, where it's basically physical need, starvation, livelihoods, things like that, then maybe we don't want to look at the current and possibly future situation of Middle Eastern Christians. However, if you want to take a thicker understanding that includes freedom of association, sort of the spiritual side of life, freedom of religion, then we have to begin to figure out how we want to address what is increasingly a persecuted group of people. Another issue that we're currently trying to figure out is we see the United States either due to weariness or due to budget considerations or other things where there is a feeling that among a growing part of the Arab population that U.S. dominance, which for instance is believed to have been heavily supportive of the Mubarak regime, the U.S. is moving away from its traditional involvement in the Middle East. It's not clear what that's going to look like, but there is now assertions by, for example, the caretaker government in Egypt to try to pull away from the influence that the United States has so heavily exercised in the last 30 years since the Camp David Accords. For example, right now in Cairo, there's a big fight going on between USAID, Agency for International Development, and the Egyptian Ministry of International Cooperation, where the U.S. government is trying to give funding to many, many Egyptian civil society organizations over a whole range of projects, and the Egyptian government is saying, no, it has to go through us. So they're sort of at a loggerhead right now, and this is an example of the assertiveness that these different emergent regimes are beginning to show. For us, in terms of operational, just day-to-day operational, we're having to balance a bunch of things occurring all at the same time. We're adapting some of our ongoing programs. We have very large programs for Iraqi refugees, but we have, with the American troops leaving at the end of the year from Iraq, with what's happening in Syria, where there's more than 750,000 Iraqi refugees and the uprising happening there, we have to sort of recalibrate and redesign how we're going to respond to this newest phase of Iraqi refugeehood. The second thing we're having to look at is basically throw away a number of different programs we're going that we've been supporting for a long time and introduce entirely new ones. For example, livelihoods programming. This is a completely new area for not only for CRS but for a lot of these governments. And one of the challenges that we face is having to figure out how are we going to work with the private sector, with business. Whereas for 30 or 40 years, many university graduates got some job in the middle of these bureaucracies, and it was basically a job for life. Well, clearly this has to change, and yet the only ones who can, given the youth bulge that's the case in the Middle East, where 50–60% of the population is under 25 years old, the only group that can be, or the only sector of the economy that can create and sustain that kind of number of jobs to respond to that number of people is the private sector. And so we need to be thinking very creatively about how we can work with the private sector to make the kinds of numbers of jobs that are required. A big issue for us is how, as an American organization, we can engage more actively in civic engagement types of programming. We've been doing a lot in the last 5 or 6 years with youth leadership training, with advocacy, with nonviolent communication and whatnot, but this really needs to be rethought and scaled up. And yet doing it in an environment where there is this sort of movement away from the overweening influence that the United States government particularly has had in the Middle East on these things. And then we also are now currently undertaking contingency planning, because we have to figure out, as I speak, we have to figure out what are the different scenarios we may see in Syria. Will we see hundreds of thousands of Iraqis getting displaced again? They ran from Iraq to Syria, now they're going to run to Turkey because things become so violent. Already 3,000 people have been killed in Syria. Tens of thousands have been detained. Yesterday, Amnesty International reported that the hospitals are being used as torture centers for dissidents. So we need to be thinking, what do we want to look at in the very short term? It seems very clear that this could go on for a number of months. I do happen to think that it will finish with this regime being thrown out, but it could be much bloodier than anything we've seen because of the sectarian nature and the history of its governance over the last 40 years. So what do we do with a large number of refugees coming in? A little bit further on, what sort of work, if the regime has changed, what kind of work can we be doing there, and the like. So we've got all of these different changes happening, trying to keep them all up in the air most of the time. But it's a very, because so much is happening in the environment, it's very difficult to say, well, this is what we're going to do the next year. It's more like every 2 months we have to regroup and figure out which of these areas we want to exist. And then, of course, over all of that, it certainly affects us, but affects everybody else, is the big overarching geopolitical questions. One of which is, I had mentioned, which is how will long repressed Islamist movements be put into the new social contract, the new political processes, the governing structure. The second one is this Arab Spring seems to be occurring within a longer term phenomenon that's happening in the Middle East, which has been called by, for example, the King Abdullah of Jordan as the Shiite crescent, sort of the increasing activity, the increasing influence that Iran, along with Hezbollah, for example, has been pushing. So it's this: what happens as all of these changes are happening within these countries? You've got Turkey becoming a much more active player within the Middle East, much so more than it's been in the last 60 years. And you've also got Iran trying to figure out where is it going to place itself within this. So that could introduce, never mind everything I've just said about the issues we're now looking at now, but some of these movements at the state level and at the geopolitical level could really throw some monkey wrenches into what a lot of people are hoping will be a gradual opening of the political systems in the Middle East. So I think we need to always keep that sort of what's going on at that bigger level, which does, can't really do too much planning about it, but it's something we always have to keep in mind. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Warwick, will you offer a response, please?
Right, thank you. That was a very, very interesting set of comments. And the problem with the luxury we have is that there is so much to think about. I have to say, CRS really has my sympathy. You're in the same position as all these academics and all these policymakers trying to make sense of this as it's unfolding, and it's incredibly complex. It would be nice if the simple narratives that we've heard from commentators in the media sometimes, if those were true, if this were all about Twitter or Facebook, or if this were all about economics, or all about Islam or something. But the problem is that, of course, that's not the case. It's society and politics, so it's multi-causal, and these complexities aren't just complex in and of themselves, it's that we've all, policymakers and activists and academics, we've had a problem of sort of too much information, but also the actors in this have been opaque to us for a long time. So we want to know what the military is going to do. We want to know what the security services are going to do. We can't always know. These have been organizations we haven't been able to see into. So trying to craft policy and carry out programs even in this environment is incredibly difficult. So it's quite a task that you all have. But it's impressive that organizations keep operating. What we hear is about chaos and unrest and unstable situations, but people are still doing their work. Organizations are, and people are, and no one knows the outcome, but things are still functioning to a very large degree. So it's important that we not just assume that the whole region is in flames and nothing's happening, I think. It's quite positive that CRS is still doing its work. I did want to say that I really like the distinction that Mr. Schnellbacher drew between subject and citizen. That's a really useful way to think about the shift that's happening. People have not had a lot of say, or any say, in their political lives, and even largely in their social and economic lives to a great degree, and what we're seeing is a shift toward a situation where people can have a say, only it's not, you don't just shift to an entirely new system, you have to build the system while you're using it. which is, again, remarkably difficult. This is really an important moment, though, and I think we should consider it an exciting and positive moment. The 80 to 90% turnout that you mentioned in the Tunisian elections, we don't get that kind of turnout here, right? In the presidential election the last time, turnout in the United States was about 62%. That's high for us. It's quite good for us. We don't get that kind of turnout because people don't feel driven to be engaged in the participation in politics in the same way because there's not as much at stake. There's a lot at stake in these cases, and people are coming out to build new systems. That's an incredibly positive thing. People are engaged enough to turn out. It's important to remember that we can't generalize this across all cases that we're looking at. Tunisia is not the same as Libya. It's not the same as Syria or Yemen or Bahrain. So I think the prospects in Tunisia and probably in Egypt are quite good. Actually, they have institutions, they have well-established middle classes, they have traditions of participation in various ways, they have strong labor organizing and things like that. In countries like Libya, we can't expect the same outcome because there aren't the institutions for people to work with. You have much more personalistic rule. So what people have to build in Libya is really, maybe not entirely from scratch, but they're building in a very, very different environment. That's a different environment for the construction of politics and also for the aid organizations and foreign governments that want to help the process along. They're going to be called on to do different things in different places. We're going to have different capabilities in different places. Can we expect all this to lead to democracy in the end? Well, I can't wait to find out, but I don't think we know now. I think the prospects are good, though, in some places. But not if you understand democracy as secular politics and secular society. And maybe a better way to think about it is not, is this going to be democracy in some way I'm familiar with, but is this going to be pluralistic politics? That is, are we going to have lots of interests in the political realm, participating and pursuing their own goals, diverse interests across the spectrum? That I think we're definitely going to see. So these Tunisian election results where the moderate Islamist party, Ennahda, did really well. Some people are saying, oh, this is alarming because they're Islamists and we know what will happen. Well, we don't actually know what will happen. But we should expect actors like that to be involved in politics. And trying to keep them out of politics would likely be a very bad thing. So we should expect pluralist politics. We should, I think, welcome competition, getting all the viewpoints out there into the system. That hasn't been something that people felt free to do before. So that's one of the most positive developments, I think, that we see, so long as we're aware we can't draw conclusions from that right up front. We have to wait and see what happens and draw careful distinctions among the types of groups that are out there. You mentioned religious minorities, and I think that's going to be an important issue, but I would also say that there's not an inherent conflict in these societies, which are predominantly Muslim, overwhelmingly Muslim. There's not an inherent conflict between Islam and Christianity or between Muslim and Christian populations. So we do see sort of catastrophic circumstances in places like Iraq, but we also see sort of back and forth, sometimes good, sometimes bad, in places like Egypt. So you've probably all heard about violence against Christians in Egypt. But I hope you've also seen the stories where Muslims and Christians in Egypt are taking to the streets together and holding up both symbols of both religions in a way that political organizing didn't work before. And then you have cases like Jordan, where you have a Christian minority population in the country and no conflict across the Muslim-Christian line, really. And the lesson there is not whether these groups are going to be in conflict based on that they are Muslim or Christian. The lesson there is that it's really important how we do politics. So the things that are happening will either create circumstances of conflict and violence across community lines, or we can create better politics that are more participatory, where that's not an issue in politics. It's certainly possible to do so, and I think the work of people in these countries is going to be the most important thing. But there's a lot that can be contributed by outside actors who are working carefully and sensitively and have years of experience in the region to know what they're doing. Organizations like CRS. So it's really interesting to hear about their programs and see what contribution that's going to be making to all this.
Thank you both so much. We have about a half hour or so left. We'd like to get in as many questions as possible. I've been told that the room is mic'd up, so you're welcome to just stand up, introduce yourself, and ask your question. If you want to raise your hand, I think I'm going to call on the first person, if that's okay. Kate, are you here?
Hi. Kate. My question today is, what role did CRS play in the Arab Spring? Were they directly involved in protest, and did they host/support peace talks?
What was the last part?
Did they host/support peace talks?
The last 4 or 5 years, we've done a lot of work in Egypt in 2 areas. One was mainly an economic program, but it was a microfinance for women, mainly in rural areas. And so in addition to sort of providing small loans, $200 for them to get involved in different sort of micro entrepreneurial activities in their villages and towns, it also had a large element of community mobilization. And beginning to talk to each other and work on issues much wider than just the particular trade that they were involved in. So I think those sorts of programs were sort of beginning to establish some of the type of advocacy and community mobilization activities which ultimately showed up in the streets of Cairo beginning last January. But no, they were not meant to do that. That was a happy circumstance that happened on the side. More directly, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been doing an awful lot of work in Egypt with youth leadership development, basically trying to, with a lot of parameters around it in areas that we couldn't go or topics we couldn't discuss, but a lot of activity with young people between the ages of, say, 16 and 23 on some basic, what is basic advocacy, what are some basic principles of community participation, of nonviolent communication and the like. And then that being sort of the training element, and then people just beginning to organize groups of young people in their communities to do some really basic stuff like cleaning up a city park or making sure that they lobby their local government, municipal government for regular trash pickup, basically to try to get people more involved in different community level activities. Again, this one was not, part of some secret plan to bring about this uprising, but certainly those sorts of activities. We worked in 10 governorates, 10 states. It probably involved over the course of 4 years, probably 100,000 young people. And it's those sorts of activities, and certainly other organizations were doing the same thing. I think a lot of the building blocks for what we saw beginning in January, and what we're seeing much more now as new governing relationships come about, we and others were definitely putting in those building stones. Now it becomes a whole different story this time, because the kind of things that we were doing training in before, basically you can use it in government, you can use it in some civic activities and whatnot. Now that things are becoming heavily political, it becomes much more difficult. People lining up with different platforms and whatnot. It becomes a much more difficult area to become involved, and we'll be continuing to do it, but it's really a different sort of programming that we've done previously.
Thanks for your question, Kate. Now we're going to turn to Cabrini College, who has submitted a YouTube question that talks about how Christians are being treated in the Middle East and what their future has in store.
There's about 350 million people in the Middle East, if you count Turkey and Iran and North Africa.
Hi, my name is Kelsey. I'm a senior communication major at Cabrini College.
I'm Holly. I'm also a senior communication major at Cabrini College.
Today we have some questions regarding Christians' role in the Arab world. When most people think about the Middle East, they think of the Arab community, but many people are unaware of Christians' role in the Arab world and how they're treated.
And so in our Convergence project, we're researching how young people are dealing with depression. We're interested in knowing more about the unknown future of the Christian community in the new Middle East, and with that, how have Christians been treated during the Arab Spring? Has there been any dangerous targeting of the Christian communities, and if so, are there any organizations that are actively helping them? Also, are young people of all religious backgrounds coming together, or do tensions still run high between the different religious groups? And for the young people, how important is religion in this new Middle East that you're building? Thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing from your response.
Hi, my name is Kelsey.
So Mark, if you could just talk about how Christians have been treated during the Arab Spring and what their future portends.
One thing I just want to start with, just a clarification. They talked about the Arab world and then Christians, as if Arabs were all Muslims. You know, Christians lived in the Middle East 700 years before Islam began as a religion. Arabs, there's a great deal of misunderstanding, I think, here in this country, where most people think Christians in the Middle East are Irish nuns or something doing missionary work in Jerusalem. But Arabs consider themselves, and certainly Muslims consider Christians as Arabs, very much, not some sort of separate group that just somehow ended up there, which is part of the big issue. I have a colleague who's from Ramallah in the West Bank who is a very devout Christian who indicates that he cannot imagine what the Arab world will be like without Christians. Christians have had such a fundamental role in the transmission of Arab culture, in the whole anti-colonialism drive 50 or 60 years ago, were incredibly important. Today in Syria, some of the biggest names in the demonstrations and the uprising are Syrian Christians. So they have been, for 2,000 years, have been a key, if increasingly smaller, a critical part of the establishment, cultural, political, and otherwise, in the Arab world. However, things are changing very much now. If you include Turkey and Iran, there's about 350, 360 million people, about 18 million Christians out of that whole population, 8 million of whom live in Egypt, who are Coptic Orthodox, and then smaller, different degrees elsewhere. Emigration has been a huge problem among Christians or a huge issue. Maybe it's not a problem, but it's been a huge issue since about the 1870s, and it's been accelerating completely. In 1948, when the State of Israel was created, the number of Christians in Jerusalem was 20%, now it's less than 2%. When in that same year, 1948, Bethlehem was 100%, now it's less than 20%. So all across the region, as I said, 2/3 of the Iraqi Christians, which are about 1.5 million, when the United States invaded 8 years ago, is now probably 500,000 at best inside the country, and many of them seem to be wanting to get out. So there's definitely pressures that have been existing pressures like immigration that have been accelerated of late, either because of people becoming refugees or people don't seeing a lot of a great future in front of them and they want to get out. But also there are certain new, let's say, challenges to the existence of Christian communities throughout the Middle East. Some of it has to do with where will this new phenomena, I mean, Islamic parties are not new, but their active involvement in the political process that's begun since January is new. For years, in Egypt, for example, certainly the Salafists were radically repressed. In the last 15 years or so, the Mubarak government made a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is less radical than the Salafists. But we don't really know where any of this is going to go. With the Salafists, I think there's definitely something to be very concerned about with regard to what's left of the Christian community. I think with other groups that are more moderate, perhaps like the Brotherhood, I think you'll get to some of these compromises that we were speaking of earlier. But I think it's a big question. And I don't think we can underestimate the example and the fear that has been introduced throughout the Middle East and among Christian communities with what happened in Iraq. In Iraq, I think sociologically speaking, you need a certain glue, you certainly need a certain critical mass to sustain a community. And I think we may well be looking at a situation where that kind of glue has been, that kept the Christian community together as fully Iraqi, as fully Arab, but also a community within Iraqi society. I think there's growing evidence that the glue that kept that society together has become very, very weak, and that it may not be able to survive as a significant minority in Iraq for my lifetime, for example. There's now more Chaldeans outside the country, Chaldean Christians outside the country than there are in Iraq. Spread from everywhere, from Sydney, Australia to Dearborn, Michigan. And there doesn't seem to be any delay in that. So I think there's a lot of questions going around in the Christian community in the Middle East. And not a lot, one of the questions was, what are people doing about this? And not a lot. There's not a lot of noise being made about this from sort of a human rights perspective. The participation, or religious freedom and participation in religious communal life doesn't get a lot of talk, either coming from the administration here and only quite occasionally from groups like Human Rights Watch and whatnot. And why this is the case is not really clear, and including from the Catholic Church. There's not a lot of noise coming out of, more and more the last year from the Vatican, but very little coming out of major bishops' conferences in Western Europe or the United States. And so it's very much something we need to watch very, very carefully. We ourselves, as part of the civic engagement programming area that we're scaling up, we're trying to figure out how to have a subsector, not exclusive by any means, but to have a subsector working with Christians specifically on basically how to help Christians become more active citizens in this new environment that they're facing. Very tricky subject, but it is one where it doesn't appear Christians will do themselves well, either as individuals or as communities, if they just sort of shrink away from this newly emergent process, but how to help them become more engaged, how to help them become their current situation become more known in the West. A lot of people in this country don't know that there's Christians whose first language is Arabic, that they've been around they speak the language that Christ did, Aramaic. That's their liturgical worship. So we need to do a lot of work on that end, I think, and we need to do some work on this end, that it's not just it's over. And there are some people in the Middle East who are very, Arab Christians who are very, very pessimistic about what the future looks like. But there are others, incredibly strong faith. I was just in Baghdad 2 weeks ago with 2 American bishops, the first time American bishops went to Baghdad since the invasion 8 years ago. And despite the fact of what that church has suffered at the end of this year, or at the end of this month, we're seeing that anniversary where 50 people were killed when they were kneeling on their knees in a church in Baghdad. It's incredibly strong, the faith and the civic engagement that people are still engaging in, but it's still, I think, a very big question. Not so much in Egypt, because there's 8 million of them. It's 10% of the population. The nature of that church is really quite different. But in some of these other countries, I think, particularly Syria, Iraq, Lebanon has its own history of civil war with that issue. I think it's a really big issue, and it needs to be, in my view, raised a little bit higher on, as a human rights issue, because that could well be what it comes down to.
Thank you. And Kelsey from Cabrini, thank you so much. We'll turn it back to students here at Villanova. That's the next question, perhaps a simpler one for Mark. Sure, stand up. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Russell from. Hi, I'm Russell from Dr. Kata's Introduction to Global Studies class. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on your staff capabilities. I wasn't sure if you said how many staff you have for starting these kind of programs in different countries that are kind of restarting their government, restructuring their government. If you don't have people on the ground in each of these countries, how would you start kind of programs like that?
We do have staff. Our biggest program by far is in the occupied Palestinian territories. We have 7 offices: Gaza, East Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethlehem, Ramallah, Nablus, and that's by far the largest one. But then we also have offices in Egypt and in Lebanon. And because of the current situations, either security-wise or because of governmental restrictions, we We don't have staff regularly assigned to Syria or Iraq, but we have colleagues who go very, very frequently to work with local organizations. We work there. Yeah, in some of the stuff we're having to restaff ourselves. For example, on the livelihoods thing, we don't have any experience of any significance to make this a major programming area. So that's starting from scratch. For the civic engagement one, we've got some rudiments in Palestine that we've been working there for a long time on this issue, which we're going to see how they can help us adapt the programming we do there in the Palestinian territories to places like Egypt. And some of the other areas which we're just sort of continuing with would be like the refugee assistance or assistance with the many guest work. With guest workers and whatnot from Asia that are throughout the Middle East. Those we're pretty well staffed for, but I foresee, we've already begun, but I foresee us doing a lot more training, because a lot of the issues that are being taken up, there isn't a heck of a lot of experience. One thing that I'm looking forward to very much in Egypt is we've been noticing a pretty substantial return of expatriated Egyptians. Either young people who came to America or Europe for school, decided they weren't going back because of the political situation there, or people who left maybe a little bit later to take jobs in the West. And we're seeing an increasing number of people like that wanting to give it a shot now that so much is being redone in Egypt. So I think we can, I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring, we've already brought 2 people like that on, and I'm hoping we'll be able to find more, because it brings sort of experience that doesn't currently exist, and yet they're Egyptians. They're not like me or you or somebody else going and dealing with civic participation issues. So I think it's a potentially big help for us.
Great, thank you for your question. We'll now turn to SUNY Albany, who's asked a YouTube question which asks about how you go from revolution to rebuilding, and some of the revolutions are still happening.
Hello, we're a class from the University at Albany. We're in Professor Harrison's public administration class, and our group has a few questions and comments for you.
All right, here are some questions we have. 1, how do you transition from a radical, violent, and exciting revolution to a rational, functional, and calm rebuilding process?
Yeah, except for Libya, sort of the revolutions that are occurring here are not like the war we saw in former Yugoslavia and whatnot, where there was extensive physical destruction to both residences and government buildings and businesses and whatnot. Here, Libya, yes, they had a lot of that, but in these other places, sort of the physical infrastructure still largely remains, although in Egypt, for example, has been largely neglected for the last 20 or 30 years. It's more social reconstruction, I guess I would call it. Social reconstruction, political reconstruction, economic reconstruction, which in many ways for organizations like ours participating from the outside is much more delicate, much more difficult than rebuilding hospitals or residences or whatnot. Clearly, it has to follow moves being made by groups of local people. And the situation I think we're finding now and we're faced for the foreseeable future is these questions, basic questions, are being ironed out. They're being very much the subject of debate and discussion every day over nargila pipes and in cafes and in government buildings and in universities throughout these countries. Some very, very basic questions are still being answered. Similarly, not quite as complicated, but still very complicated, is the whole, what are these businesses going to look like? What is the economy going to look like in these countries? If you look back the last 30 or 40 years of let's say, Egypt's economy, you went from Nasser's very much to Arab socialism, where the state was hugely important. The last 10 years, a lot of opening in the economy has occurred. Still, a predominant role for the state, but many aspects of it became much more capitalized. What are people going to choose? now? Is it going to be, where do they want the whole thing to go? So these sorts of questions are ones that organizations like CRS, we basically just have to wait and see where these discussions go, and then place ourselves somewhere within that resulting environment to see, how are there ways that we can support it. I think, quite honestly, for the next couple of years, because of the scale and the scope and the complexity of the political questions that need to be answered, the form of governance that's going to be coming, and how people are going to be gradually understanding what it means to be an active citizen, I think we're going to sit out of this stuff. And I think it's dangerous to be involved. I think it's maybe if we were from Luxembourg or somewhere like that, I feel more comfortable doing it. But being an American organization, given the history of the United States foreign policy in the Middle East since at least 1948, and given some of our recent actions there, our government's actions there, it's a very delicate issue for us to becoming one and becoming involved in. And I think we probably need to wait it out. Probably still be involved in youth leadership development, advocacy, sort of basic tools that work whatever level of government you're working in, or even if you're working in with a local Rotary Club or something. But I think we're really going to stay out of this because I just think it's highly critical. It's really the biggest questions these countries are facing, it seems now. I therefore think we're probably going to get more involved in over the next couple of years, probably more on the livelihood section and more on the economic side of things, because I just think there's too much at stake, and we're just, as an American organization, we're not in the right place at this point to be doing a lot on the political side of things as far as the specifics go.
Thank you, SUNY Albany. Do we have another question here at Villanova? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Nico Timpani from Dr. Getting Soltice's this class. And obviously there's a lot entailed in the types of operations that are going on. What would you say is the greatest challenge that CRS faces in achieving its goals?
My greatest concern right now, and in the last month and probably the next month, is what's going to happen in Syria. Given the nature of and how we will react, both in the immediate term and then some longer, it's not going to go well. It's not going well. It's not going to get better before it gets a lot worse and then starts to go up. I think it will take quite a while. The regime is extraordinarily entrenched. 40 years, a father and his son have been ruling the place. It's ruled by a small minority of Alawites, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. They represent perhaps 10% of the population. The largest population group in Syria is Sunni, and then there's a significant Christian population, probably 15%. Like in Egypt, the last 10 years has been a big opening in the economy compared to 30 or 40 years of Arab socialism. And for a long time, people didn't think the revolution was going to move there because they sort of had traded a little bit better wealth for some of the highly restrictive political environment that they lived in, but then it broke. There's a lot of fear, and I think quite legitimately, that as bad as we saw the sectarian violence in Iraq in 2006, 2007, it actually could be worse in Syria. The Alawite group that controls the country is very important. They lead the army, they lead the regime, they also have important but not singularly important parts of the economy. The Sunni merchant class is also very strong, and so are Christians in the trades. It could come down to sort of a battle for the death. That there's great concern that the Alawites are hanging on and are reacting increasingly brutally to the uprisings because there's a growing concern that if it flips, there's going to be just a massacre. The Christians are also largely, not that there isn't any Christians who are participating in the uprising, of course there are, but across the board, leadership of the church, at least publicly, is coming out in favor of the regime. Because extremely concerned about what happens if this whole thing sort of centripetally just goes flying out of the place. So that's one element, is just where, this is going to go on for a number of months, I believe, and
Sorry, Mark, to cut you off. We just have about 5 minutes left, and I want to get a response from Catherine, and then be able to close it out.
okay. So our concern would be, what sort of contingency planning do we need to make now? What happens if hundreds of thousands of Syrians come running across the border? Second, there's 750,000 Iraqis in Syria, many of whom fled sectarian violence in Iraq, went to Damascus. Are they going to become displaced again to Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey? So how do you react to that situation where persons have been persecuted for religious reasons twice in the last 6, 7, 8 years? That's the immediate concern. Then what's it look like afterwards? It's very much a closed society, and compared to a lot of the other ones around, what sort of, with much less interaction, a form of organizations like CRS or CARE or Save the Children or anybody. So it's going to be a completely different ball of wax in Syria in the long term for organizations like mine than anything we've experienced elsewhere in the region because of the way it's been closed. So that's my biggest sort of immediate, among all a few other things, but this one is the one that we're really having to give a lot of thought to, because we could be, and the position the United States is taking on. We gotta continue to, sometimes I really do wish I worked for Caritas, the church from Luxembourg or something, because it would be much easier if we were from a small little place, but we're not, and deal with it.
Thank you, Nico. Great question. Professor Warwick, if you could just close us out with a few final thoughts.
Sure. Lastly, I would add to the Syria comment that one thing everybody wants to know is whether the military will withdraw its support from the regime. And one of the reasons that's hard to predict is because no one knows along what lines it might fragment. It could be the sectarian lines you're suggesting, or they could just make a calculation that this regime is going down and they want to walk away. But until we sort of know which way the security apparatus goes, it's hard to say how long the regime can hang on. And everyone's in this position of wondering and not having information. The other thing I'd suggest is you mentioned choices. People have a lot of choices to make in politics and in economics. But they don't make these choices just sort of out of thin air. They make choices within structures. And so the first task, going back to the Sunni question, one of the first tasks that the societies are facing where the regime has fallen is to create new structures. So they're creating electoral laws and constitutions. They're deciding how to put together a body that will then write the new rules for the new structure under which people will make these choices about economic policy, about representation, party makeup, and things like that. The power to make those choices, that is the fundamental question in politics. So the processes that we see now that are going to result in people who draft a constitution, that's where a lot of the power is, and the outcome of that will shape what choices people get to make in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Mark Schnellbacher and Professor Catherine Warwick for your time today. Thank you to the students here who asked such great questions. And thanks to Villanova University for hosting us, especially Margaret Kowalski and Sue Toten for your hospitality. Thanks to everyone else who participated on this GSN session from the campuses of Cabrini College, Catholic University, Creighton University, Gonzaga University, Siena College, St. John's University, St. Mary's University of Minnesota, and SUNY Albany. We hope that you'll remain engaged on this topic. You all have a handout, our recent action alert about Iraqi refugees, and we ask you to ask President Obama and your members of Congress to protect Iraqi refugees and protect poverty-focused international assistance, which is used to support Iraqi refugees and other poor and marginalized in the region. You can also sign up for our final GSN session, which takes place November 7th through 11th, and is geared around what can you do as college students to become engaged and to act in solidarity with the poor and suffering in the Middle East. I also want to draw your attention to two other events later today at 2:30. There's a symposium in the Villanova room of the Conway Center, which Mark will be at. And at 4 p.m. there's a faculty forum in the President's Lounge at the Conway Center. And we welcome you all there. Thank you so much, and thank you, Professor Warwick and Mark Schnell.